So let me open it up and tell you what's going on. Execute always is nice. Most of the time when we run scripts on our objects in the game, they only work while we're running the game. So when we're pressing play. Execute always means it also runs in the editor, and we want that specifically for this so that we can tell where our clipping plane is. This is our class name. It's inheriting mono behavior. It has a serialized field, material mat. So this is just the material that we're going to use on our object, our house at this point. And that just, we're putting it here so that it can tell what material to render and what material not to. If we had a different material that we were using on the house, it would just always render, and this script and the entire shader would be useless. So we need to make sure that we're using the same material. In the update, so this happens every frame, what we're doing is we're creating a plane, transform up and transform position. So this is creating a flat plane. Vector 4 plane representation, we're making a new vector 4 that's just using the normal of the x, the normal of the y, and the normal of the z. So these are things that are perpendicular to the x, the y, and the z, and then the plane distance. So this is the distance from 0, 0, 0. And then what's happening is material.setVector, plane representation. So we're putting this into the shader with the variable plane. So in our shader, we're going to have a variable called plane, and that's what we're setting it. We're setting that variable to plane representation, which is this vector 4. And this happens every frame. So that what that means is that when we move our plane around, all these calculations will be updated. We have this now, and we're getting an error down here, object reference not set to an instance of an object. What's happening is because it's executing always, it needs to have a material always, even when we're not playing it. And we don't have that set up, so I should probably do that to take this error away. So I have a material called clipping plane. And if you look at the shader and the material shader settings, there's not a whole lot. I'm just going to use a color. And then clipping plane, make sure I'm using the same thing here. And there we go. It's already clipping. I drag it up, drag it down. You can see I can make my entire house disappear. I can make part of it disappear. I can bring it from the ground up. So why don't we have a look at what the shader is doing? Here is the shader. Custom clipping shader. And I have attached this when I created my material, my clipping material. I made sure to use this particular shader. We're using a tint, we're using a texture, we're using smoothness as well. That's one of the things we can do. Very smooth textures like glass or I guess polished metals will be smooth, or rougher things will have a much smaller smoothness factor. So like it's cement will have a very small smoothness. Blender uses roughness instead. So 1 in Blender will be a 0 in Unity. There's a couple differences. They usually play well together. You got to be on the ball though, just to keep track of the differences. Again, we're using opaque and geometry. We're going to use cull off though. And what that means, usually we have cull on, and that means we don't see the backsides of things that we don't see. So if you have a cube on screen, you'll see all the sides of the cube, but there's no point in rendering the backside of the planes of the cube because all they're doing is pointing in. But in this case, because we're clipping part of it, we do need to see the backsides, and that's why we're turning this cull off. Again, surface, surf, standard, fall forward shadows, target 3.0. This means we're trying to use the third version. That's fine. Unity today is up to, I think, the 5th or the 6th version. So Target 3.0 is a number of years ago. Sampler 2D is the main texture. Color, smoothness, half. This one's a new variable type. If you remember from Java, we had double, which is twice a float. So we can guess that half is half of a float. It just means it's taking up less memory than a float would. We have float for plane. Here's what the script is doing. Remember, plane is setting it to plane representation. So right here is where we are getting our plane representation. So we have an input structure that's a UV main texture, float 3 world position, and a float that's facing. We're going to use these down in our surf calculation. So we're going to get a distance, which is a dot product between the eye world position and the plane XYZ. And then we add it to the plane W. Then we clip minus the distance. This is a little tricky to get your head around. Like, dot products are something we all had to learn about in high school and then promptly forgot. Even I am a little hazy on what this is doing. And so if you want to know more, I highly encourage you to go to Ronia's tutorials. And I'll try and have the link several times in my blog post so you can see what's going on. Because not only does she do the clipping plane, she does a number of other tutorials that are incredibly helpful. We have a float facing, which is just if it's facing up or facing down, essentially. So we're trying to determine, are we culling or are we clipping the top half or the bottom half? And then again, we do our color stuff here. Getting the texture, multiplying it by our tint, and then setting the albedo. And then here we have O.smoothness. And then if it's facing, whichever direction it's facing, that's what we can make smooth if we want to. There's a number of other things too. We could use emission if we wanted to make some of our panels glow. We could use emission. We could use metalness, I think. It might be metallic. But we can make certain materials more metallic. I don't know why it's not just a Boolean, because some things, materials generally either are metal or aren't metal. They're not like halfway metal, but I guess that's the way that they're doing it. And then we end the CG, and our fallback is standard. So this is just if something like goes drastically wrong, it'll go back to the standard. Though if you do make a minor mistake, usually what happens is that you'll just get like a white silhouette of the shape that you want instead of the instead of, or a purple one, instead of it actually falling back to standard.